The Crimean War, a conflict draped in romance, tragedy, and heroic symbolism. Before we begin, take a moment to like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications. We learn about Florence Nightingale, the lady with the lamp, moving like a beam of compassion through the suffering halls of Scutari. We hear the thunder of hooves as the Light Brigade charges headlong into cannon fire, transformed by Tennyson's verse into a monument of courage. We see the noble defenders of the Ottoman Empire standing shoulder to shoulder with British and French troops, united against Russia's southern advance. This is the version of history framed in museums and textbooks, a righteous struggle, a clash of powers, a humanitarian mission wrapped in imperial flags. But if you step behind the paintings, if you brush aside the sentimental fog that has settled over this war for more than a century, you find something else. A truth so cold, so calculating, that it makes the battlefield heroics look almost irrelevant. Because beneath the Crimea's gunpowder smoke, the future of the Ottoman Empire was not decided by soldiers, but by bankers in London and Paris, men in polished boots and tailored suits, who decided with a flourish of ink what no army could enforce with bayonets. This is the story of how Britain used a war dressed in noble intentions, to quietly maneuver the Ottoman Empire into a terminal debt trap, a financial chokehold from which it would never escape. This is the story of life support disguised as rescue, of loans presented as lifelines while functioning as shackles, and of an empire slowly bleeding out in the quiet halls of European finance. Because the ink on the bank ledger was, indeed, redder than the blood on the battlefield. When the Crimean War began in 1853, the Ottoman Empire was battered, yes, but it was still sovereign, still independent, still capable of paying its way through life. It had zero foreign debt, not a coin owed to Europe. In a world where empires rose and fell on credit, the Ottomans stood alone, free of foreign bonds, foreign banks, foreign claws that would not last. The war was the perfect storm. Russia's threat was real. The Ottoman treasury was strained, and the British government knew exactly how to turn crisis into opportunity. Because Britain didn't want the Ottoman Empire strong, and it didn't want it dead. What it wanted was an empire on life support, kept alive just long enough to block Russia, but weak enough that every breath depended on British approval. A dependent empire, a manageable empire, a puppet empire. And so came the bait. The loan of 1854, the first foreign loan in Ottoman history. Officially, it was framed as assistance from Britain and France, a supportive gesture toward an embattled ally fighting a dangerous aggressor. But the terms, cruel, predatory, meticulously engineered to ensure dependency. The interest rate alone was enough to make even seasoned European ministers raise eyebrows. The repayment terms were painfully short, and the collateral, nothing less than the tribute revenues of Egypt, one of the wealthiest territories in the entire empire. Imagine the humiliation. A sultan pledging Egyptian revenue like a man pawning his wedding ring just to afford a week's worth of food. This was not help. This was the handshake that picked the pocket. This was the lifeline that strangled the swimmer. The moment the ink dried, the Ottoman Empire was no longer debt-free. It was now plugged into the European financial bloodstream, and the bankers would never let it go. Debt is a drug. Ask any nation that has tasted it. The first dose is intoxicating. Fast money, quick relief, a feeling of renewed strength. But the second dose is needed sooner. And the third even sooner. And before you know it, you're no longer taking the loan. The loan is taking you. In 1855, another loan, this time with harsher terms. Even higher interest. Even more backdoor control ceded to British and French financiers. By 1858, an empire that had survived for centuries had begun behaving like a client state, dependent on the approval of foreign bankers to meet payroll, maintain infrastructure, even feed its troops. And by 1862, the addiction reached its grotesque peak. A gigantic loan advertised as a modernization package. Railways, telegraphs, schools, hospitals. But behind the glossy facade were interest traps that were impossible to escape. Even paying the interest required borrowing more money. A debt spiral, a financial vortex. A slow drowning with no surface in sight. Meanwhile, the contradictions inside the empire grew surreal. At the very moment when ministers begged for funds to pay soldiers, the Sultan erected the Dolmabahce Palace, an extravagant fortress of marble and crystal so expensive that even European monarchs whispered in disbelief. This palace, this shimmering monument of excess, was built entirely with borrowed gold. And as its chandeliers glowed over lavish halls, tax collectors returned from rural provinces empty-handed. Farmers refused to pay, local economies collapsed. Bread riots swept cities, and provincial governors muttered the unthinkable. Perhaps Istanbul no longer deserved their loyalty. The empire was rotting from the outside in, even as its capital gleamed from the inside out. In these years, European diplomats often described the Ottomans as a sick man, a phrase that would stick like a scar. But the truth is far darker. It was Britain that kept the sick man alive, not out of compassion, but because a dying man can resist nothing. A patient on life support is easy to control, and Britain controlled the machine. By the early 1870s, the Ottoman state budget was no longer a budget, it was a prayer. More than half of all revenues went to paying foreign interest. Salaries went unpaid, corruption spread like wildfire. Russia circled like a wolf. Western investors demanded higher interest for every new loan. And finally, the inevitable happened. In 1875, the Ottoman Empire announced that it could no longer pay its debts. A sovereign bankruptcy. This wasn't just a financial crisis. It was the moment the empire's independence died. The European powers responded not with armies, not with coercion, but with something far more effective. The OPDA, the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, founded in 1881. It was a state within a state, a ruling power within the empire, a non-military occupation that didn't need soldiers because it controlled the one thing soldiers require: money. The OPDA seized the empire's most profitable revenues at the source: the salt monopoly, the silk industry, the tobacco farms, the alcohol trade, stamp taxes, fisheries, the entire infrastructure of state income. Ottoman citizens now paid taxes that went not to their own government, but directly into the hands of European banks. European accountants replaced Ottoman ministers. European inspectors replaced local officials. European financiers dictated state policy. This was colonization without invasion, empire without legions, control without war. The Crimean War had created a precedent. Finance could achieve what armies never could. Debt was the new weapon of empire. By the time the 20th century dawned, the Ottoman Empire was Ottoman in name only. Behind the Sultan's robes in the grand palaces stood an economic machinery directed from London and Paris. The public saw a sovereign state, but beneath the surface was a puppet dancing on financial strings. And all of it, the downfall, the dependency, the quiet colonization, began with one war, one loan, one signature pledged in desperation. This is the true dark history. An empire defeated not by swords, not by armies, but by interest rates. Debt proved more dangerous than a standing army, more lethal than an invading force, more permanent than conquest. Britain did not conquer the Ottoman Empire. It purchased it piece by piece, loan by loan, ledger by ledger, until the sick man of Europe could breathe only with British permission. History remembers the battles, but battles were not what doomed the empire. What doomed it was the silent, invisible war of credit, a war fought in banks, not trenches. If you found this investigation eye-opening, help this channel uncover more hidden truths by liking this video, subscribing, and sharing it with others. Together, we reveal the shadows behind the stories you thought you knew. History is never innocent, and sometimes the quietest weapons leave the deepest scars. History is underwritten.